So I recently read an article in Foreign Affairs called No Substitute for Victory, which is kind of a classic article from my view on the Cold War tension between the good guys in the US and the bad guys in China. And the article basically makes the point that war with China over Taiwan is probably inevitable, that China's got a number of challenges they're not going to be able to overcome. The US has to step up and take advantage of this opportunity to finally put China in its place and prevail. So let me start as a first point with history, which is something that I think the US does not spend a lot of time on, but is extremely important in China. I think if you listen to the US, they would say that China's economy has peaked. China is in decline. Therefore, China has a limited period of time to be able to assert itself in Taiwan, and therefore conflict is inevitable. But I think what's lost on most people who are not close to the situation is that the Han population in China is 92% of the total population. The Han population in Taiwan is 98% of the population. And therefore, from the Chinese point of view, this is bringing someone back into the fold who has been part of China for a very long period of time. So the second point I'd like to make has to do with the military dimension of all of this. If you read the article, No Substitute for Victory, it basically makes the point that China is naturally aggressive, is naturally militaristic. But the reality is, if you look at major countries around the world and ask the question, where has military aggression taken place? It has not been China. And that's not surprising because the Chinese are ultimately pragmatic. And the reality is, if you look at all of the wars that have been fought in history and ask the question, who won those wars? Almost every war ultimately turns out to be a lose-lose. And by that, I mean the economic drain is enormous on the one hand, and the human drain is enormous on the other. So the Chinese, being pragmatic, have a strong bias to not engage in war. So let's move past the military point and look at the economic point. One of the points that's made in the article is that China is in precipitous decline, both in terms of economics and in terms of the happiness of its people. And China has plenty of problems, so let's not deny that. So China has an aging population. The number of people who are of working age is gradually declining and has a number of other internal issues like high debt and like youth unemployment that it's trying to deal with. But the reality is, if you think about what the underlying factors that have driven the Chinese economy, they're pretty sustainable. They have a very strong industrial policy. So if you look at how they have evolved from when Deng took over in the 1980s as the country that had the lowest cost labor globally, they dominated very simple commodity and became the world leader. But then China basically evolved from low-cost labor to dominating high-end manufacturing. And China has already achieved that in electric vehicles. China has been dominant for many years in renewable energy in terms of wind and solar. And China has been the global leader in high-speed rail for many years. So, the US just has to accept that reality. And it's not going to be a question about how do we control and contain China. The question is, how do we as a country want to respond to that? The first, if you come back to the immediate issue of tension, which is Taiwan, if you understand the role of culture and history in China, China would say, these are our people. These are Han people. These are Confucian people. Why would we ever invade and inflict damage on them? And so when anyone in the West says it's inevitable that there will be a war between the US and China over Taiwan, completely miss the reality that from the Chinese government's point of view, that's the last thing they ever want to have happen. The other thing I'd like to say is that in terms of where China is and its economic opportunity going forward, so if you look at China today on three different dimensions, so one of them is urbanization. The biggest lift in China over the course of the last 25 years has been moving people out of farms and into cities. Most major countries in the world today are 80 to 90% urbanized. China is only 60% urbanized. So China has a long way to go to take advantage of that productivity lift that comes from moving from 60% urbanized to 80% urbanized. The second dimension is incomes. If you looked at the incomes of Japan before they went into their period of stagnation, their income levels were comparable to those in the US. Today, China's income levels on average are 1/3 of the US. So the upside from an income point of view are enormous. So when you think about those areas, China is really just getting going. So this kind of leads me to my final conclusion. The notion that the US can contain China is fundamentally flawed. So the US has two choices. The not good choice is where this article was pointing, which is we can contain China and beat China on its own terms. The second choice is we can't contain China. We can compete against China. So let's improve our education system. Let's improve our productivity. Let's get smarter about where we put our resources. And if we do all those things, we will be a very strong competitor to China going forward. But the problem is you can't do both at the same time. If your mindset is we can contain China, then we're not focused on getting better ourselves. And that is a losing proposition.